In 1920, a Viennese economist published a paper that made an extraordinary claim. Socialism cannot work. Not won't work. Cannot. Not as a matter of politics, as a matter of logic. The academic world laughed. 50 years later, after the Soviet Union had misallocated the labor of hundreds of millions of people, collapsed entire industries, and produced chronic shortages of basic goods, the world stopped laughing. The man who wrote that paper in 1920 was Ludwig von Mises, and almost everything he predicted came true. Hi folks, how are you doing? Welcome back. Last time I accidentally announced Hayek as our next economist. My apologies for that. I want to introduce these thinkers chronologically, so today we start where we should have started, with Ludwig von Mises. Ludwig Heinrich Adler von Mises was born on September 29, 1881, in Lemberg, a city that was then the capital of Galicia, a province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today, that city is called Lviv, and it is in Ukraine. His father was a railroad construction engineer employed by the Austrian imperial government. His mother came from a prominent Viennese family. Her uncle served as a deputy in the Austrian parliament for the Liberal Party. The family was Jewish, cultured, and deeply embedded in the intellectual life of the Habsburg Empire. When Ludwig was still a small boy, the family moved to Vienna. This was not just a change of city. It was an entry into one of the most intellectually charged environments in the history of Western civilization. Vienna at the turn of the 20th century was extraordinary. Freud was developing psychoanalysis. Wittgenstein was rethinking the foundations of philosophy. Klimt and Schiele were redefining art. And in the economics departments of the University of Vienna, a revolution in economic thought was quietly underway. The Austrian school. In 1892, young Ludwig entered the Akademisches Gymnasium, one of Vienna's most prestigious preparatory schools. He received a classical humanistic education: Latin, Greek, history, philosophy. One of his classmates was Hans Kelsen, who would later become one of the most influential legal philosophers of the 20th century. Already as a teenager, Mises was deeply interested in history and politics. But economics came later, and when it did, it changed everything. In 1900, Mises entered the University of Vienna to study law and political science. He arrived, by his own account, as a leftist interventionist, a young man who believed governments could and should manage the economy to improve social outcomes. Then, in the fall of 1903, he picked up a book, Karl Menger's Principles of Economics, or Grundsätze der Volkswirtschaftslehre, the founding text of the Austrian school, converted him completely. Menger's insight was simple but devastating. Economic value is not determined by the labor that goes into producing something. Value is subjective. It exists in the mind of the individual making a choice. A glass of water in the desert is worth more than a diamond. Context determines value, not production cost. This idea, marginalism, dismantled the classical labor theory of value that Marx had built his entire system upon, and it set Mises on a path that would define his life. After graduating with a doctorate in jurisprudence in 1906, Mises became a student in the famous seminar of Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk, a former Austrian finance minister and the second great pillar of the Austrian school. Bohm-Bawerk had already written the definitive refutation of Marx's theory of capital. His seminar was legendary. Among Mises's fellow students, Joseph Schumpeter. This was not an economics department. It was an intellectual arena. By 1912, Mises had already produced his first major work, The Theory of Money and Credit. The book did something the Austrian school had never fully done. It integrated the theory of money into the broader framework of marginal utility. Money, Mises argued, is not demanded for its own sake, but for what it can purchase. Its value, like all value, is subjective and marginal. More importantly, the book contained the seeds of what would become the Austrian business cycle theory. The idea that economic booms and busts are not random events. They are caused by central banks artificially expanding credit, pushing interest rates below their natural market level, and flooding the economy with money that distorts investment decisions. If you watched our last video on the AI boom, you already know where this leads. The theory of money and credit was used as a standard money and banking textbook for 2 decades. In 1926, Mises founded the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research and hired a young economist named Friedrich Hayek as its first director. That relationship would shape the next century of economic thought. In 1920, Mises published a paper titled Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. The argument was as follows. A functioning economy requires prices, not as labels on goods, but as signals. Prices communicate information about scarcity, about consumer preferences, about the relative costs of different production methods. They emerge from millions of voluntary transactions between buyers and sellers. In a socialist economy, the state owns the means of production. There is no genuine market for capital goods, for factories, machines, land, raw materials. Without that market, there are no real prices for these goods. Without real prices, there is no way to calculate whether producing steel with method A or method B is more efficient. Without that calculation, resources cannot be rationally allocated. Socialism, Mises concluded, makes rational economic calculation literally impossible. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine you are the Central Planning Committee of the Soviet Union in 1960. You need to decide how many shoes to produce, in what sizes, in what styles, for which regions. You have no price signals, no system of profit and loss telling you what consumers actually want. You have surveys, quotas, and guesses. The result: Soviet citizens in 1980 waited years for apartments while warehouses overflowed with unwanted goods. Chronic shortages alongside chronic surpluses, simultaneously. Not because Soviet planners were stupid, because without prices, nobody can know. That is the economic calculation problem. The socialist academic world spent 20 years trying to refute this argument. Oscar Lange famously proposed a market socialism model where planners would simulate prices. Mises was unimpressed. A simulated price is not a price. It does not carry the information that only emerges from real transactions between people with real stakes. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 did not settle the debate in economics journals, but it settled it in reality. In 1922, Mises expanded his 1920 paper into a full book, Socialism, known in German as Die Gemeinwirtschaft. The book was a systematic demolition of socialist economics, philosophy, and sociology. It did not merely argue that socialism was inefficient. It argued that it was structurally incapable of achieving its own stated goals. The book had an unexpected reader, a young Austrian economist who, at the time, was a committed socialist. Friedrich Hayek later said that reading Socialism was one of the decisive intellectual experiences of his life. It did not just change his views on economics, it changed his worldview. That is the measure of an argument. Not that it convinces those who already agree, but that it converts those who don't. Through the 1920s and early 1930s, Mises was at the height of his influence. He taught at the University of Vienna, without a paid professorship, because, as Hayek bluntly explained, he was a Jew, he was known to be aggressive, and he was an anti-socialist. He ran private seminars that became legendary. Among his students, Fritz Machlup, Gottfried Haberler, Oscar Morgenstern, names that would define post-war economics. But Europe was changing. the National Socialists were rising in Germany. Austria was drifting toward authoritarianism. In 1934, Mises left Vienna for Geneva, where he taught at the Graduate Institute of International Studies. In 1940, as the Wehrmacht swept across Western Europe, Mises and his wife Margit fled again, this time to New York. He was 58 years old. He had left behind his library, his manuscript drafts, his career, his world. He arrived in America with almost nothing. He left Europe with everything that mattered, his ideas. In 1949, Mises published his magnum opus, Human Action. It is one of the most ambitious books in the history of economics. Nearly 900 pages. A complete reconstruction of economic science from first principles. The foundation is what Mises called praxeology, the science of human action. All economics, he argued, must begin with a single irreducible fact. Human beings act purposefully. They use means to achieve ends. Everything else follows from that. From praxeology, Mises derived the entire structure of economic theory: price formation, capital theory, monetary theory, business cycle theory, and the impossibility of socialist calculation, in a single unified system. The book contains perhaps his most quoted line on the relationship between socialism and capitalism. Socialism is an alternative to capitalism, as potassium cyanide is an alternative to water. He was not known for understatement. Human Action remains in print. It is still read. It is still argued about. Very few economics books published in 1949 can say the same. Mises was not without critics, and serious ones. Keynesians argued that his business cycle theory ignored the role of aggregate demand. His rejection of empirical testing — he believed economics was a deductive science, not an empirical one — put him at odds with the mainstream of the profession. His political views, his uncompromising defense of laissez-faire capitalism, made him a difficult figure for an academic establishment that was moving decisively toward active government management of the economy. He never received the Nobel Prize. In 1969, the American Economic Association named him Distinguished Fellow, a late and partial recognition. The year after Mises died in October 1973, his most distinguished student received the Nobel Prize in Economics. That student was Friedrich Hayek. Today, the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, carries his name and his work forward. His books are freely available online. His ideas are cited in debates about cryptocurrency, central bank policy, government stimulus, and, as we discussed in the last video, the AI boom. Mises spent his life making one argument: that the price system is not merely a mechanism for buying and selling. It is the only known method for coordinating the knowledge of millions of individuals who will never meet, never speak, and never know each other's needs. Destroy that mechanism through central planning, through monetary manipulation, through artificial price signals, and you do not create a better economy. You fly blind. He wrote that in 1920. He proved it in 1949. History confirmed it in 1991. And if you watched our last video, you know why it might be relevant again today. Next time, Friedrich Hayek. Till then,